Today's message is going to focus on a number of different people. I'm not going to call you out by name. I'm totally just kidding. We're not. It's nobody in this room specifically, but it might fit. It's a number of different types of people coming together on a Sabbath day, and the expectations that they have on that day. And so turn with me to Mark. Mark chapter 3. And I'd encourage you to follow along in the Word. So I encourage you to open it up to Mark chapter 3. We're going to look at the beginning of Mark chapter 3 as well as the very end of Mark chapter 2 for today. And just as a starting point, we're actually going to start at the very end of the verses that we're going to read. And we're going to read verse 6 first, just to set the conclusion. And in verse 6, we read, "And the Pharisees went forth and straightway took counsel with the Herodians against him, how they might destroy him." And so two of the groups of people that are invested in this day's passage are the Pharisees and the Herodians. And if you recall, for those of you that have heard the last message, I think it was the last message, we did a little bit of a conversation about who the Pharisees were, and just did a little bit of a dive. So I'm not going to recap all of that, other than to point out that the Pharisees were looked up to in this time. They were the theological progressives of the time. They were in favor with the common people, with the normal everyday people, because they didn't come across as elitists during that time. I think when we look at them, we sense elitism across the board. They weren't seen that way at the time. They were challenging everybody that they needed to live separated lives for God. And so that's who the Pharisees were. The Pharisees, at the end of this message, are so frustrated with Jesus that they are trying to figure out how to destroy him. And we're going to kind of dive into how they get there. The Herodians, and this is another group, we don't know much about the Herodians other than the understanding that they were likely a political party. Think today's version of Democrats or Republicans, right? They're a political party, and what they're focused on is actually considering how to keep Herod in power. So King Herod is king at this time, and the Herodians see stability in the political system as it's been organized, and so they're in favor of keeping Herod in power because there's stability. We could spend a whole message talking about whether that's a good thing or a bad thing. It's irrelevant. What's relevant is that they're trying to keep the status quo because they see stability in the status quo. Maybe they see monetary gain in the status quo. They see that the Romans have given the Jewish people at least some semblance of self-control during this time. And so they see value in it. And they see Jesus as creating instability, right? And so they see that the situation that Jesus has just created is inherent instability, and so they are against Jesus. And so they're looking at how to destroy Jesus along with the Pharisees. And that's where we end this message. Where we start this message is in verse 23 of Mark chapter 2. And we read, and it came to pass that he went through the cornfields on the Sabbath day. And his disciples began, as they went, to pluck the ears of corn. And let's just, to be clear, because originally I actually was just taking this at face value. This isn't actual corn. They didn't have corn in this time, like we know corn. This was grain. And we don't know exactly how they, in Matthew chapter 12, it says they began to pluck the corn and to eat it. So we're not sure what kind of grain this was. It was either something that they could chew on as they plucked it, or they were plucking it and they literally took some time to cook it that day and found a time to somehow eat it, right? But somehow they were eating whatever they were plucking, and it was a type of grain. And so just imagine that in this moment, that as it came to pass that Jesus is going through the cornfields on the Sabbath day, and his disciples began, as they went, to pluck the grain and to eat it. That's Matthew 12, verse 1 through 8, speaks to that context. And the Pharisees, and by the way, this was the week prior. Okay, so in the moment, as we're talking about this, imagine today's the day. Today's the Sabbath that we're going to be talking about. Last Sunday, Jesus was walking through the cornfield on a Sabbath day, on a Saturday, not a Sunday, but on a Sabbath day. We're just pretending it's Sunday because today is this day that we're about to talk about. That 7 days ago, Jesus is walking through a cornfield. His disciples start to pluck grain from the field as they're walking by, and they're either eating it or they're baking it and doing something with it, and they eat it. And the Pharisees said unto him, Behold, why do they on the Sabbath day that which is not lawful? And he said unto them, Have ye never read what David did when he had need, and he was hungered, and they that were with him? And so we're not going to get into this dialogue back and forth between Jesus and the Pharisees, but the Pharisees are frustrated. And let's just be clear as to why they're frustrated. So you're not supposed to work on the Sabbath, right? You're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And to us, it might be crazy to think that plucking some grain as I'm walking by and popping it in my mouth, or perhaps sitting down to bake, is working, is doing what I'm not supposed to. But let's just step back for a second and remember what I said about the Pharisees. They're really focused and really focused on the need to separate ourselves from the world and to do what God is telling us to do, right? That separation from the world, from society at that time, to live separate lives dedicated to God. And so where does that statement align with that plucking ears of grain or kernels of grain and chewing them or baking something is work? Well, if you go all the way back to when the Jewish people were wandering in the wilderness and they were lacking food, remember that God was providing manna. He was providing food from heaven. And on the day before the Sabbath, they would get twice as much. Remember that? They would get twice as much as they got any other day. And they were supposed to collect twice as much. And only on that day, the food didn't rot. Interestingly enough, the food didn't rot. And they were able to have enough for the Sabbath to eat on the Sabbath because of the work that they did the day before. They didn't work on the Sabbath. They had it already there, already prepared for them, and all they had to do is eat it. Okay? So that's like going all the way back. But there is this notion of working on the Sabbath that's continually stressed by God. The prophet Nehemiah, when he goes back to Jerusalem, when he goes back to after, like during the captivity. So there's a captivity. There's a group of people that go back from being taken captives by Babylon and later by Assyria. They go back to restore Jerusalem. They're not doing a great job at restoring Jerusalem. Nehemiah comes back. He's a prophet. He, in essence, kind of for them, he comes back. He's actually, the king's cupbearer at the time. But he comes back and he challenges the people of what they're doing. And what's happening in Jerusalem at that time is that there's a market on the Sabbath. People are buying and selling. People are coming into through the gates of Jerusalem, and Jerusalem's a marketplace. And I'm kind of just describing it loosely because we're not going to take the time to read it. And Nehemiah stresses and challenges the people that this is not supposed to happen, right? You're not allowed to do this on the Sabbath. This is not what God wants. And so he kicks everybody out. And then if you were to read Nehemiah, I think it's chapter 13, just going off of memory, they start to have a market outside the city. And Nehemiah says, listen, if you don't disband, if this doesn't stop, the soldiers that I brought with me, we're going to make it stop. And he brought soldiers because he was the king's cupbearer. So he's like, we're going to make this stop, right? And so he gets that serious about the fact that they're not supposed to work on the Sabbath. And in the Pharisees' eyes, now we fast forward to Jesus' time, the work on the Sabbath was doing stuff beyond just going to synagogue. beyond just resting. Okay, so they have this dialogue with him, and Jesus responds to them in verse 27. He says, "And he said unto them, the Sabbath was made for man, and not man for the Sabbath. The Sabbath was made for the good of man." It was for us to rest, not for us to just focus just solely on the Sabbath itself. "Therefore the Son of Man is Lord also of the Sabbath." And so he challenges the Pharisees with this statement. And I'll tell you, this riles them up. Okay, this gets their blood boiling, because he's totally going against what they see the Bible saying, and what they've been taught and what they've been teaching, and this is creating on a small level instability, right? Right. This is starting to create instability. And how is it creating instability? Well, you're going to start to have some people who are going to start to do work on the Sabbath. They're going to start to cook things. They're going to start to take this lightly. And then you're going to have Jewish people who are going to take it seriously. And this is going to then create this between Jewish people, right? And guess what the Romans don't want? They don't want instability. And if you get this, then the Romans are going to kick Herod out, and we're like taking this to an extreme now, because this is going to the umpteenth level. But they're going to restrict Herod's ability to govern. They're going to come in. They're going to remove our ability to self-govern, and they're going to take over. So now we have the Herodians who would be upset about this potential instability, and we have the Pharisees who are upset about this. And all of this jumps to chapter 3. And Jesus, the next Sunday, today, in this moment, as we're imagining it, today on the next Sabbath, and Jesus entered again into the synagogues. As a side note on this, right, and this is actually just a refresher if you were to dig back into a message that Brother Alex had a number of months ago, where he focused on Luke chapter 4. There's a verse in Luke chapter 4 where we read on verses 16 and 17. In verse 16 it says, "And he came to Nazareth," this is being Jesus, "where he had been brought up, and as his custom was, he went into the synagogue on the Sabbath day." Okay, Jesus went to church. That's what that says. That's the modern day version. Right? Jesus went to church, as his custom was, as he was brought up to, as he expected to, as his mind was set to. This wasn't, maybe I'll go. I feel guilty if I don't. My mom and dad are going to smack me if I don't. This wasn't like, maybe I'll just sit home in my PJs and watch on live stream today because I don't really feel like going, or I really want to make it to whatever, and so I'm just going to do it from home today. Right? No, this was Jesus saying that synagogue was the place to be. And so as his custom was, he went there every Sabbath. Every time he could, he was there. And so in Luke, that's what his custom was, he goes there. In Mark, and he entered into the synagogue. Again, right? This wasn't an abnormal occurrence for Jesus. He's there because that's where he's supposed to be. And that's where his mind is set to. And that's where he's going to teach. And so he comes to synagogue. Imagine coming to synagogue. Imagine this being that day. And you've heard rumors that the prophet is going to be here today. That healer man might be here today. That man who's creating turmoil and that the Pharisees are really ticked off at is going to be here today. And you're driving here. What would you be thinking? Like, what would be going through your mind today? Would you be excited? Oh, this is going to be cool. I wonder if the Pharisees are going to show up. I'd love to see some, some real, stuff go down in church today. Is that what would be going through your mind? Would there be a little apprehension? Maybe I shouldn't go. Maybe I shouldn't go to synagogue today because I don't know what's going to happen. I'm not sure what's going to go down. Let's just avoid the conflict and not go today. I don't know, just think about what you would be feeling, knowing that potentially Jesus was going to be here today. But not the Jesus that we know. The Jesus that the Jewish people would have known in that moment. And so, there's all kinds of people coming to synagogue on this morning, on this day, right? There's the people that come every Sabbath. The people of that village, of the town, the men, the women, they're probably coming separately, and they're coming in, and they see Jesus, and there's probably an entourage with Jesus too, his disciples, because he's not coming by himself. There's other people coming, and so the group is coming. The doors are open. People are coming in, and you come into synagogue on that Sabbath day. And there's somebody else there too. And on that Sabbath day, we read, and there was a man there which had a withered hand. Now, we don't know anything else about this man, right? All we know is that there's a man that had a withered hand. Maybe he was a villager. And maybe he came every Sabbath. Maybe he heard that Jesus is going to be here. And so he came in the hopes that his withered hand would be healed. Maybe less likely so, maybe it was the setup by the Pharisees. They want to see what Jesus is going to do, so they pay off this withered man. That's not likely, but based on what happens. But regardless, there's a man with a withered hand. And now, what do you do? Like, for some of us, we like to be here 10 minutes early. Some get here just in time. Some like to be 10 minutes late. Some just can't help but be 10 minutes late. We're all across the board as a people. And I'm not judging or criticizing anybody. That's just the reality of what's happening on any given Sunday, right? On any given Sunday for us, we're just happy to be here if we can make it on time. And sometimes we're running late. Sometimes we're running early. Some of us have to be here earlier. We get upset if we're not early. But we run the gamut. And so on that Sabbath, you had the same thing happening more than likely. You had people that were coming in early, people that had their spot already. You had people that were coming in just on time. You had people that were maybe scrambling to get here. But you come in through those doors, and I don't know exactly how the synagogue is set up other than men and women would have been in very separate areas at the time. And so you walk into synagogue, and you see a man with a withered hand. And I would tell you that more than likely, the first thing you do is try to figure out how you can stand away from that man with the withered hand, right? Because what would that man be implying? We know from John chapter 9, chapter 10, I'm drawing a blank, that they would have likely thought that the man with the withered hand had sinned, okay? That there was sin in this man's life, and that was the reason he had a withered hand. And so they would have avoided that man, because there is potential sin, likely sin in that man's life that caused that withered hand. And the Pharisees teach we need to stay away from those people that are sinners. And so I respect the Pharisees and their teaching. I'm going to stay away from that man. Okay? That's the first thought that would have gone through your mind. The man with the withered hand likely couldn't work. And so he was already potentially a little bit of an outcast, even if he was in the village and a villager, and his clothes wouldn't have been as nice as anybody else's. His clothes might have smelled a little bit worse than anybody else's. And so step 2 would have been, there's other reasons to avoid this man. And so you walk in the synagogue, and the first thing you do is you see that man, and you're like, oh, all right, I'm going to avoid him. But there's other people that are here this day too. If we keep reading, we read, and they watched him, whether he would heal on the Sabbath day that they might accuse him. And so you see that they are the Pharisees. And so there's a group of Pharisees that are here this day. You walk into synagogue on this Sabbath, and not only is there a man with a withered hand, I mean, if you're here early, you've already got your spot, and people are starting to show up, and maybe you're trying to scoot around, right? But if you're one of those late people, or one of those people that just on time, and you're walking through those doors, you're like scanning, and you're going, oh boy, what do I do? Because I've got a man with a withered hand, and even if I would feel good about maybe just, standing next to him to see if I could give him a little support, because he's looking a little lonely out there by himself. There's a group of Pharisees that are right here, and they're probably front and center, right in the front. And they have eyes. And I'm like, well, I don't want to stand next to them. And if I stand next to him, then they're going to be upset with me, right? So I don't want to stand next to the man with the withered hand. And, man, it'd probably be best if I just avoid the Pharisees. Better appreciate them from a distance than up close. I think most of us would feel that way. And so I'll just stay further away. So I got the man with the withered hand, and we'll just say he's over here for the time being, and he's rather lonely and isolated in the synagogue, more than likely. I've got the Pharisees who are in a group by themselves, and they got laser beams for eyes. And guess where their eyes are pointing? They're not at the man with the withered hand, right? They've got laser beams for eyes, and those laser beams are all dots on the body of Jesus, because Jesus is there too, if I came in just at the right moment. They want to see what he's going to do, because they've got plans. They're frustrated with Jesus. He's undermining their teachings. He's not looking at what the scrolls say in Nehemiah. He's ignoring what happened during the walk in the wilderness when God fed the people. And he's totally not getting that. And he's allowing his disciples to undermine the Sabbath by working on the Sabbath. And so let's see what he's going to do with this man, right? Let's see what he's going to do with this man. That's the situation at that moment in the synagogue as you walk in. So what do you do? Well, just maybe some of you would just like turn around and walk back out. Forget it. I'll come back next Saturday or next Sunday if it was today, and we'll just let this play out, and I can just hear what happens after the fact, right? Maybe some of you are oblivious and you don't even realize what's happening, and you just come in and grab your seat like every Sunday because that's what you do. Just a question, like, what should they have done? What should they have done? What should you do? What should the Pharisees have done? I was thinking about what they did. They focused on a couple passages, on a couple thoughts. But let's look at Hosea for a second. Hosea 6, verse 6. This is what God says. For I desired mercy and not sacrifice, and the knowledge of God more than burnt offerings. So, God says, I desire mercy. I don't desire your blind obedience. I don't desire you giving me a sacrifice, your payments. I just desire your heart. I desire your mercy. Right? I desire the obedience that comes from the heart, not the obedience that comes from just following the ritual of the rule. And Zechariah, In chapter 7, verses 8 through 10, we read, "And the word of the Lord came unto Zechariah, saying, Thus speaketh the Lord of hosts, saying, Execute true judgment, and show mercy and compassion every man to his brother." Showing mercy, compassion. So what they should have done is the Pharisees should have come in and seen the man with the withered hand and should have embraced him. And really what they should have done is they should have seen the man with the withered hand and they should have gone to Jesus. And in reality, they should have gone to Jesus and said, "Jesus, we know you can heal. Would you heal this man, please?" Right? Isn't that what they should have done? If you were just a person that had heard about Jesus and heard that he was a healer, would you have come up to Jesus on that Sabbath morning, on that Sabbath day, and said, "Jesus, I know that the Pharisees are struggling with this, but would you please heal that man? Would you please heal that man?" That's what should have happened on that day. But we read that that didn't happen on that day. That some people felt really nervous about offending the Pharisees, and so they don't say anything. We see that the Pharisees are so focused on Jesus and on what he's doing against the law, against what they've established, that they don't even think about that man that's hurting, and that man with the withered hand, and that man that has no ability to work, and that man who's likely an outcast in his village and is definitely feeling like an outsider here this morning in this synagogue and that morning. And so everybody just takes their spot. Some people just brimming with anger and frustration over the fact that the normalcy of what they do and how they worship is being threatened. Right? That's what's happening, is that their way of worship is being threatened. And they're frustrated by that, they're bittered by that, and they're angry, and they're looking at how to fix it. And that's their focus on that morning. And other people are just trying to stay out of the way and just let the day be like it's supposed to be, and I wish this could just all go away. Whatever happens, I wish it would just be normal, right? And so you have people who are wishing it would just all be normal. You're having people who are frustrated and angry and bitter about the way things are playing out and what Jesus is doing. And you have people who are just trying to be on the sideline and avoid the whole thing. You have the man with the withered hand who would love to have it healed. And he's the focus of all of this in such an inappropriate way. And so, what caught my attention with this passage was their inability to get it and their lack of focus on what Jesus was really teaching. And the fact that in one of the rare instances in the New Testament, Jesus gets angry. We don't read about Jesus being angry very often. If you think about the times when Jesus is angry, if you know your Bible, right, one of the times that Jesus is angry is when he flips the tables of the money changers at the temple. And he shows his anger and he flips the tables, right? He gets angry at the desecration of his father's house. Here we read, and they watched him, saying whether he would heal him on the Sabbath day, that they might accuse him. And he saith unto the man which had the withered hand, Stand forth. And he saith unto them, Is it lawful to do good on the Sabbath day, or to do evil? To save life, or to kill? Which one's right to do on the Sabbath? So, Jesus says, on the Sabbath, are you allowed to kill? If I asked you that question, on a Sunday, are you allowed to kill people? Is it lawful? Is it appropriate for you to kill somebody on a Sunday? What would you say to me? I'd venture to guess that everybody in this room would say, no, Bob, I don't know, I'm not sure why you're asking that question. That's ludicrous. That's silly. No, it's not legal to kill or lawful or appropriate to kill somebody on a Sunday. I mean, in fact, that question is so obvious, and the answer is so obvious to a question that's so silly, we know it's not right to kill, let alone on a Sunday. And so his question to them is supposed to be obvious, right? His question is not rocket science. It's not supposed to be hard. He simply asks, is it appropriate? Is it appropriate to do good on a Sunday, on a Sabbath, for them on a Saturday? Is it appropriate to do good? Or is it appropriate to kill? Which is appropriate? They don't answer. Is it appropriate to do good or to do harm on a Sunday? Is it appropriate to save a life or it is appropriate to kill on a Sunday? That's a question for us in today's situation. Like, if I asked you that question, not in a sermon where it's rhetorical, where we were literally having this conversation and expected an answer, I would venture to guess that every one of you would answer. And I would venture to guess that I would know the answer that every one of you would give. Thank God that I would know the answer that every one of you would give. Because every one of you would hopefully say, Bob, it's appropriate to do good on a Sunday. And it's not appropriate to do harm. Bob, it's appropriate to save a life on a Sunday. It's not appropriate to take a life on a Sunday. And the Pharisees are so far off the mark on this specific Sabbath day that we're talking about that they choose not to answer. Right? They choose not to answer. Because intellectually, they know the answer. It's obvious. It's not a hard answer. It's not a hard question, and it's not a hard answer. It's obvious. Intellectually, they know it. But if they answer correctly, they lose the high ground. They lose the argument, right? They lose the argument. We read in Matthew, if I remember correctly, in the same kind of parallel passage, it goes into more detail. And Jesus asked them a little bit more detailed question. He asked them a more detailed question. He says, is it appropriate, would you, if I remember correctly, it was a cow. I should probably look so that I don't mess it up. In Matthew 12, verse 11, he says, I was going to say cow, it's a sheep, so I'm glad I looked. What man is there among you that if he has a sheep and the sheep falls into a pit on a Sabbath, which one of you wouldn't get the sheep? Right? Would you wait until Sunday? Would you wait until the next day to get the sheep? Or would you just get the sheep out? Because it's obvious what you do. So if that's so obvious, why is this so hard? Why is this so hard? And I think that's the challenge for us, right? There's, sorry, let's finish the thought. But they held their peace. And when he had looked around about on them with anger, being grieved for the hardness of their hearts, he said unto the man, stretch forth thine hand. Stretch forth thine hand. And so there's situations that are happening here now. Let's just play this out and finish this story. We're running out of time. So Jesus, with all of this in the background and all of this at stake and all of this tension, right? Jesus stands up, as is a kind of tradition, to teach. Because every adult male had the opportunity to teach, to say their piece at synagogue. And so he stands up and he says his piece. And instead of rolling out the scroll this time from what we can tell. Maybe he did that too. He looks at the man who's probably tucked away on the side with the withered hand, and he tells this man, come forth, stand forth, come up, get up, stand up, come over here. Okay? And I want to talk about that man for a second, because I would venture to say that some of you are that man. Like, there's, hopefully none of us are the Pharisees, but there's probably a little bit of all of these people that we're mentioning in this room today at some little level. But some of you are definitely the man with the withered hand. And this man, he has a choice to make. This man can stay in the shadows, can stay in the background, because that's the way he's lived his life. Right? That's the way he's been treated. He's a little bit of an outcast. He's shunned a little bit. He's off to the side a little bit. And he can stay in the shadows because that's the easier place to stay. And Jesus says, stand up. Stand up. Today, Jesus, to some people in this room, saying, stand up. Come forth. Come to me. Right? This man is taking a risk. We talked about risk this morning in Bible class, and the risk that Naomi and Ruth and Orpah had to take. This morning, we're continuing this topic of risk with the man with the withered hand. So this man has to make a risk, has to take a risk. He can stay in the background and say, I'm not getting up, Jesus. But just maybe, he came to be healed. And this is his chance. This is his chance. And he was not expecting the Pharisees to be there as a group up front. Laser beams at Jesus. And guess what? When Jesus looks at the man and says, stand up, guess where those laser beams went? Boom, on that man right there. And he's got all of these eyes. The whole room is looking at him right now. The whole room is looking at him. And Jesus says, come on forward. What do you do? What does the man do, and what do you do? Right? When Jesus calls, the risk is everything I know, everything I am, the society that knows me as I am. That's the risk, because I got to leave that. Right? I got to leave the safety and the comfort of the shadows to come into the limelight. And Jesus is calling. And this man needs to make a choice. And this man steps into the limelight. And Jesus doesn't just say now, right, this is the risk. Jesus doesn't just say, you're healed. Jesus then makes an example out of him. He makes an example out of this man, because now he looks at the Pharisees and says, is it appropriate to do evil or good on the Sabbath? Is it appropriate to save a life or to kill on the Sabbath? And the Pharisees choose not to answer. Right? The right answer should have been, Jesus, it's appropriate to do good. Jesus, it's appropriate to save a life. Jesus, save this man's life. Do good to this man on the Sabbath. And Jesus would have said, amen. And Jesus would have said, you are healed. Instead, they hold their peace because the way that they worship, who they are, their identity is being threatened. And they don't show mercy. They don't show mercy. They have no mercy. And Jesus is angry. Jesus is angry. And he doesn't heal this man to spite them. Right? He doesn't heal this man in spite. It's not like, I'm going to show you to the Pharisees, you're healed. That's not what he does. He was going to heal this man already. But he's angry at the Pharisees. And God forbid that Jesus would ever be angry with any of us and work in spite of us, rather than work through us. Because on that Sabbath day, he worked in spite of the Pharisees, in opposition to the Pharisees, not with and through the religious people of the time. Now, I know, and I would expect that if a man with a withered hand came into this place, that some of us would sit with him or with her. I mean, we better. But I would know that because I know you. I expect those things of you. That's what God expects. But would you individually do that? As a group, I know some of us would, but as individuals, would any one of us do it? Or would we expect somebody else to? Are some of us so focused on the way of worship that we lose track and lose sight of the mercy through worship that's supposed to take place? Because true worship would have been Jesus healing with the blessings and the requests of the people rather than in opposition to the people. And they didn't worship that day, right? They didn't worship. Jesus acted, but they didn't worship. The worship would have been asking Jesus to heal, watching Jesus heal, and then praising Jesus because he healed. That would have been worship. And if you're the man with the withered hand today, if Jesus is calling and Jesus is knocking and Jesus is pulling at your heart's door, right, are you choosing to stay in the shadows because you're afraid to risk? You're afraid to risk. Or are you willing to step into the limelight and be healed? Because this is the power of Jesus, is that he will heal regardless of what the world expects, regardless of what the world says, regardless of what the world and society demands. Jesus can heal. Jesus can make things whole, and he can make you whole today. Amen.